We're in Exodus 19. Next month, we're going to start Leviticus, and then after that, Numbers. So there's going to be some parts of the weekly readings that may not be your bedtime devotional material, right? Well, that's a good point, yeah. But what I want us to see is that even though, we talked last week about the difference between reading and studying. Reading brings exposure, studying brings understanding. So as we read these chapters and as we study them on Sundays, I think we're going to see a really rich a depth that is from these chapters of the Bible, even though they may be boring to read. Whenever you sit and you study them and you connect the dots, especially when you see how it points to the New Testament, it's so rich. So we're going to be studying Exodus 19 through 24, talking about God's covenant for a delivered and called out people. Israel was delivered from Egypt. They were called out of Egypt, and now they're being brought into covenant with God at Mount Sinai through the giving of Moses' law. And you can immediately see the connection with the New Testament. New Testament, we are delivered from sin. We are called out from the world. The word ecclesia, church, comes from the Greek word ecclesia. It literally means called out to an assembly. We're called out and we're delivered to be in a covenant relationship with God. So as we go through these chapters, we're going to be looking at three major points and focusing on what happened and how we connect that to our faith today. So, number one, called to covenant. In Exodus 19, I want you to look at verse 4. In verse 4, it says, "Ye have seen how that I did unto the Egyptians, and how I bare you on eagle's wings, and brought you unto myself." So God delivered Israel from Egyptian bondage to bring them into a covenant with Him. Today, God delivers mankind from sin to bring them in a covenant with Him. The thing to focus on there is that deliverance precedes covenant. Deliverance comes before covenant. That's the main point there from verse 4. Now, look at verse 6. Verse 6. "And ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel." Kingdom of priests and an holy nation. The Israelites were to be priests. Think about the work of a priest. It's one through whom someone goes through to get to God, right? Or get to someone, right? In this case, God. Israel was to be the light of the world and the salt of the earth. See Matthew 5:13 through 16. And you can even see this just in the geography of Israel, of the Promised Land in the Old Testament, where you have the Mediterranean to the west, the Mediterranean Sea. It was called the Great Sea in Bible times. And then to the east was all desert. It was all desert because you had today it's called the Euphrates, the Tigris River. That makes the what is it called? Mesopotamian something? The Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent. And so with the geography, if you wanted to get from Middle East, from Europe to Africa, you had to go through Israel. So Israel, if you think about just the geography alone and God's wisdom, he put them right there in basically the middle of the world, and the whole world can see God. They were to be that kingdom of priests to show God to the world and be the ones through whom they can come to God. And in the Old Covenant, something that we need to realize is that the giving of the Ten Commandments and the giving of Moses' law was not just for Israel. Every nation was amenable to Moses' law. Now, there were certain things like the ceremonial laws, the dietary laws, stuff like that were specific to Israel. But if you look at the moral law, like the Ten Commandments, the moral law, all nations were amenable to that law. For example, in the book of Jonah, Jonah was a Jew, and he went to Nineveh to preach to Gentiles to tell them to repent. So if they weren't amenable to Moses' law, then why was he preaching to Gentiles, right? So that's just one example of that. So again, there would to be that kingdom of priests to show God to the world. And you can see that just through the geography. There were to be a holy nation. They were not just delivered, they were set apart. The dietary, ceremonial, and moral laws were given to make them distinct from the nations around them. You read all these laws in these, quote, boring chapters, I guess you could say, and it's like, why did they not have to mark their bodies? Why did they not have to do that? Why did they not have to do this? It was because God was telling them, look, you are different. You are set apart. You're a holy nation, not just morally, but you're to look different, be different, act different, walk different, talk different. They were set apart. They were a holy nation. What they ate, how they worshiped, how they lived, all marked them as God's people. And so this idea of the kingdom of priests and a holy nation, right? That was ultimately fulfilled in Christ's church. I want you to turn with me to 1 Peter 2:9. 1 Peter 2:9. First Peter 2 and verse 9, but ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, and holy nation, a peculiar people, that ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Peter's writing to Christians. You are a royal priesthood, a holy nation, peculiar people. So this idea of the of the kingdom of priests and the holy nation ultimately is fulfilled in Christ's church. All Christians are priests. We are to show God to the world. Peter said, show forth the praises of him who hath called you. The church is a holy nation, distinct and set apart from the world in what we drink, how we worship, and how we live. We're to live morally. All right, now let's go back to Exodus 19. Back to Exodus 19, focusing on verses 7 through 8. Exodus 19, 7 through 8. And Moses came and called for the elders of the people, and laid before their faces all these words which the Lord commanded him. And all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord hath spoken, we will do. And Moses returned the words of the people unto the Lord. So they were delivered from Egypt. They were called out of Egypt to be brought into covenant with God. And what do they do before the covenant is official? They agree to the covenant. And we're going to see this again in chapter 24, where you have the covenant proposed, right? And here in 19, but then chapters 20 through 23 are the conditions of the covenant. And verse 20 and chapter 24, they're going to agree to the conditions of the covenant, right? You think about a covenant, it's a contract, it's an agreement. So you have those terms of the contract. Well, you have to agree to those terms in order to be in that covenant. So here, they are committing themselves to the covenant. After Israel was delivered, they committed themselves to keep God's covenant. So we think about in the New Testament today, right? Before you decide as a sinner to get into covenant with God, you have to agree to the conditions of the covenant. You have to say, all that the Lord has spoken, I will do, I will keep. Because before you sign that contract, right, if you have a mortgage, right, you signed and you said, I'm going to make those payments, right? And it's the same with our covenant with God today. Before we get into a covenant, we have to count the cost. We have to say, okay, this is what I have to do as a Christian. And I'm committing to that, and I'm going to do that. The Christian has to be faithful until death after he or she is delivered from sin and called out of the world. All right, now, chapter 19, verses 8 through 25. Kind of a lengthy passage there. We're not going to necessarily read it. But basically what happens in this passage is that the people they are to sanctify themselves. They are to wash their clothes. Another instruction was, they were not to lay with their wives. And so they were to sanctify themselves. That's the main point. Sanctify yourself, wash your clothes. So they had to sanctify themselves before they approached Mount Sinai. And that's where God was. They approached the mountain on the third day, according to verse 11. And the people stayed at the base of the mountain. So the people are at the base of the mountain. And then in chapter 24, we're going to see that the leaders, they go up to the mountain, and then Joshua goes a little bit further, but Moses is the only one who actually goes all the way up. But the people approached the mountain on the third day, and they stayed at the base of the mountain, and they did that after they sanctified themselves. Before they approached God, they sanctified themselves. Verse 16 mentions that there were thunderings and lightnings, so you can see that God is fearful. That approaching God is not a joke. It's not something to be done lightly. He's to be feared. He's to be revered, right? And you can see in these chapters, these people were afraid of God. They did not want to get near God, right? Because there was a sense of fear there. And verse 12 mentions that they were not to touch the mountain. So if we think about today, right, you can see the connection. Before we approach God in worship, we have to sanctify ourselves. We don't have to literally wash our clothes, but figuratively speaking, we wash ourselves, right? And we make sure that we do not approach God casually or on our own terms, right? What we're in this passage, they were to approach God on the third day, right? So what if they approach God on the second day or on the fourth day, right? No, the third day. So New Testament, right? When are we to come to worship? On the first day of the week, right? And God is to be feared and revered. Just look at these chapters and see how they feared God And that's something that we can learn about God. We can't just approach him in a nonchalant manner. God does not call us to come as we are. He calls us to come prepared to meet him on the first day of the week, sanctified and with reverence. All right, so they were called to covenant. Number 2, let's look at the conditions of the covenant. Conditions of the covenant. This is chapter 20 through 23. So chapter 20, this is verses 1 through 17. You have the giving of the 10 commandments. This is the moral law of Moses' law. The moral law of Moses' law. The first 11 verses, and you can organize the 10 commandments into the vertical law and then the horizontal law, right? So your moral duty or obligation to God, and then the moral obligation to your man to the left and to the right. Now, before I go any further, and we studied this a few months ago, right? But we need to understand that we're not under the 10 commandments today. That this is the giving of the of Moses' law, and the New Testament in the book of Ephesians says that those ordinances were nailed to the cross. So, whenever Jesus came and he instituted his church on the day of Pentecost, that's when the New Testament was put into place. So we're not under the 10 commandments today. So the first 11 verses, you have the vertical law, right? Verse 3, you're to have no other gods. Verses 4 through 6, no idols. Verse 7, don't take God's name in vain. Verses 8 through 11 is the Sabbath law. The Sabbath law. And then verses 12 through 17 is the horizontal law. So verse 12, honor your father, your mother. Verse 13, don't murder. 14, do not commit adultery. Verse 15, do not steal. Verse 16, do not bear false witness. And verse 17, do not covet. So this is the moral law. We think about the New Testament connection. Let's go to Matthew 22. Matthew 22, 37 through 40. Matthew 22, 37 through 40. 22, 37 through 40. And let's start at verse 36. So this guy asked Jesus, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? Verse 37, Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and the great commandment. And the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and prophets. So Jesus he's quoting the book of Deuteronomy chapter 6. And it's known as the Shema. This is something that the Jews would recite every single day. So he breaks down these 10 commandments into love God and love neighbor, right? So this is what morality hangs upon. It hangs upon loving God and loving your neighbor. And you can categorize all that we are to do as Christians into those two laws, right? Love God and love your neighbor. All right, going back to Exodus 20. And verses 22 through 26 gives us principles of worship. So chapter 20, verses 22 through 23, they were to have no idols, And then verses 24 through 26 describes proper altar construction. So they weren't to worship in any way they wanted. Worship was regulated. So there is a regulation regarding their worship, and it's the same for us today, right? We cannot just approach God however we want. There are regulations set forth in the New Testament on how we are to worship today. We're to worship on the first day of the week, Acts 20, verse 7. We're to sing, Colossians 3:16, Ephesians 5:19. We're to pray, give, preach, and partake of the Lord's Supper, Acts 2:42. So in the Old Testament, there were regulations in how they were to worship, and it's the same for us today. All right, now chapter 21 through chapter 23, verse 9, it describes the standards of daily living. These laws concern justice, servants, personal injury, property, fairness, and compassion. So from this we learn that covenant affects daily life. It wasn't just a law that you hang on your wall and now you're good to go, right? And then you don't live it out, right? Some people, they think Christianity is, oh, well, I have a Bible on my kitchen table, I'm good to go, and that's it, right? But no, it's not just having the law. Just having the law doesn't mean that you're keeping the conditions of the covenant. There were the conditions of the covenant included standards for daily living. And so we think about today, right? Those who are in covenant with God today, those who are Christians, live by a different standard than the world. We're to live the way God commands. How being in covenant with God changes one's life. You can see a difference between someone who's not a Christian and someone who is a Christian. In chapter 23, verses 10 through 33, there's the call to faithful obedience. So you have Sabbath laws, feasts, and promise of blessing and warning of judgment. Obedience brings blessing, and disobedience brings consequences. So, same thing with the New Testament, right? If we live faithfully, we're going to be blessed. But if we do not live faithfully, then we're going to have consequences brought upon us. In Hebrews 12, it talks about correction and chastisement. So those who are God, right, in His providence, corrects and chastises His children who are not doing what they ought to do. And if someone who's a Christian persists in unfaithfulness, then the result is the loss of his or her soul. So in chapter 23, verses 10 through 33, there's that call to faithful obedience. And it's the same for us today. We are called to live faithfully. So the conditions of the covenant, chapter 20 through 23, we see the moral law, the standard for daily living, and living faithful until death, and then worshiping faithfully. And it's the same today, of course. All right, so now, number 3, the consecration of the covenant. So this is chapter 24. So verses 1 through 3, Israel accepts the conditions of the covenant. Let's look at verse 3. Verse 3. And Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord and all the judgments. And the people answered with one voice and said, all the words which the Lord hath said, we will do. So they were called to covenant. They were delivered from Egypt, called to covenant with God. God said, okay, here are the conditions of the covenant. And now Israel is accepting the conditions of the covenant. They're saying, okay, this is the conditions. You know what? We want to be in covenant with God. We are accepting those conditions. And so now they're going to be brought into covenant with God. So today, as I stated earlier, we have to accept the conditions of the covenant before we commit our lives to Christianity. All right, now let's look at verse 8. And I want you to notice that so they accept the conditions of the covenant. Verse 8, those in covenant with God are covered with blood. So verse 8, it says, and Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning all these words. So they were delivered, called out. God said, here are the conditions. Okay, you accept the conditions. Now you're covered with blood. If we go to Hebrews 12, let's go to Hebrews 12, verses 22 through 24. Hebrews 12, starting at verse 22. But ye are come unto Mount Sion, and unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and the innumerable company of angels. So, context here, the author of the book of Hebrews is contrasting Mount Sinai and Mount Zion. And those are figurative for the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? So verse 22, you're come to Mount Zion. All right. Verse 23 says, to the assembly of the church of the firstborn, which are written in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect. Verse 24, this is the key verse here. And Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaketh better things than that of Abel. So Old Testament, they accepted the conditions of covenant and they were sprinkled with blood. Same thing with the New Testament, right? You accept the conditions of the covenant, you're baptized into Christ, now you're washed by the blood of Christ. You're covered by Christ's blood. So those in covenant with God are covered with blood. All right, now chapter 24, verses 9 through 11. Let's go back to Exodus 24. Exodus 24, verses 9 through 11. Let's note that covenant leads to communion. Covenant leads to communion. Starting at verse 9, then went up Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. Verse 10, and they saw the God of Israel, and there was under his feet, as it were paved work of sapphire stone, as it were the body of heaven in his clearness. Verse 11, and upon the nobles and the children of Israel he laid not a hand. Also they saw God and did eat and drink. And the Lord said unto Moses, or we'll stop there, verse 11, right? So they're now covered with the blood, and the 70 elders and Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, so now they're covered by the blood. Now they can touch the mount and they can go up Mount Sinai. And in this passage, it says that they saw God, and now they're having this feast. They're communing with one another. It says they're eating and they're drinking, right? So the connection that we can make in the New Testament, right? Once you're covered by the blood, now you can commune with God and the church, right? So you're able to approach God in worship, and you're able to commune with the church. And you can see that with the Lord's Supper, where we commune one with another, and worship in general. But so once you're covered with that blood, then you can touch the mountain and approach God. Now, chapter 24, verses 12 through 18 records how Joshua and Moses go up. So you have, right, the people. Let me get my stick here. Right? So the people are down here, and then you have Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel, right? They go up, right? Joshua goes up about here, but Moses is the only one who goes all the way up. So the lesson is that the mediator is closest to God. The mediator is closest to God. He was the only one who went all the way up to the mountain to meet with God. That's when he received the law of Moses, and he was the mediator of the Old Testament. So in the New Testament, the mediator of the New Testament, New Covenant, is Jesus Christ. And he is closer to God than anyone else. He sat down at the right hand of the Father, right? He's there in heaven with God, and he's closest to God, right? And if let's go to John 12:49. All right, John 12:49 says, "For I have not spoken of myself, but the Father which sent me. And he gave me the commandment what I should say and what I should speak." So Moses goes up to the top of the mountain to get the law of Moses to give to Israel. And you think about Jesus Christ, he went up to heaven, and he said that before he ascended, he said that what I'm speaking is not from me, it's from God the Father. So Jesus Christ got his instruction and from God and instituted the law of Christ, under which law, or the law we are under today. All right, so but the key that I want us to focus on here is that the mediator is closest to God, right? Moses was he was the mediator between God and man. He was the only one who went up to be with God. Jesus Christ, mediator of the New Testament, he's at the right hand of the Father. He's closest to God. So Israel was called to a covenant. They had to agree to the conditions of the covenant, and then after they did that, they were covered by the blood, and they were in covenant with God, and then they were able to go on to the mountain and commune with God. So for us today, God is calling every single one of us out from sin. He wants to call you, he's calling you out from sin. He wants to deliver you from sin. But the only way you're going to do that is by going through the Red Sea, figuratively speaking, right? Because the Old Testament, right, they were in Egypt, and they went through the Red Sea. They were baptized unto Moses, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and then they were brought to the Promised Land. After they were brought into covenant with God and then brought into the Promised Land, right? So for us today, we can be delivered from sin and go to the Promised Land, but we have to go through the waters of baptism. And if you've never been in covenant with God, then you can't have that communion with his people and with him, and you can't enter into heaven. You can't go through the Jordan River and enter into heaven, into the promised land. So, and for those who are in a covenant relationship with God, right? As we talked about, the conditions of the covenant, in Old Testament, right? Some of those conditions of the covenant was the standards for daily living and the expectation for faithful living. So for us today, we have to live by a different standard from the world, and we have to be faithful if we want to be blessed and not cursed. So if we have a need today, then we expect